Welcome, true believers. Today we have a daring tale of good versus evil, strength versus smarts, and Marvel versus Capcom. First off, I'd like to thank my supporters over on Patreon who helped make this video possible. The financial assistance has been invaluable right now, and if you'd like to help me keep making videos or even just get cool benefits like cosplay photo sets like my Rogue cosplay, feel free to sign up at the links down below. Now, without further ado, Capcom and Marvel. Two major brands that go together like peanut butter and jelly. Well, if peanut butter and jelly hadn't been seen together for over a decade, and nobody could get a peanut butter and jelly sandwich without paying over $100 on eBay. You see, once upon a time, Capcom ruled the fighting game roost, big time. In fact, people tend to forget that they almost single-handedly drove the 2D fighting game genre into the ground. After the massive success of Street Fighter II and its subsequent entries, Capcom hit the gas through the 90s and never let up. You got Street Fighter, Darkstalkers, Red Earth, Cyberbots, plus a host of great beat-em-ups, some of which has also been forgotten to time. But Capcom teamed up with another 90s powerhouse during this time, Marvel Comics. At the time, Marvel was going through a surge in popularity thanks to the X-Men animated series and subsequent tie-in toys and media. Capitalizing on this, Capcom made X-Men Children of the Atom in 1994 in Japan and the following year in Europe and North America. The game was immediately a hit and would lead to not one but 7 2D games collaborating between Marvel and Capcom. But what happened to the Marvel vs. Capcom games? How did they start so strong and die out so quickly? And why haven't we seen any re-releases? Let's find out as we dig into more of the forgotten side stories of gaming in this episode of Dead Domains. When Children of the Atom hit, it was in the middle of prime time for X-Men. Chris Claremont had just ended his legendary run on the comic series just a few years earlier, and the classic X-Men animated series was in its second season. Street Fighter II, meanwhile, was on its 4th major update, Street Fighter II Turbo, by 1994. These were hot properties, so it makes sense for Marvel to agree to a collaboration. Children of the Atom is a strange game to go back to. There are plenty of hallmarks that would make their way into later MVC games, including iconic characters like Sentinel and Wolverine. But being a one-on-one fighter, it has a very different approach to later tag-based games. This is a fighter cut from the same cloth as Street Fighter, with emphasis on spacing and footsies, and balancing short combo bursts with long-range projectile play. The characters are immediately recognizable as Capcom infused, from the Zangief-inspired moveset of Colossus to Sentinel and Silver Samurai, who are highly reminiscent of Darkstalkers, Anakaris, and Bishamon respectively. This is pure, unbridled 90s goodness. From the great score to the classic X-Men designs, and the effort that went into the game makes for the ultimate X-Men fighting game experience. Based on the Fatal Attraction storyline, Children of the Atom is full of odd, deep cuts that faded into obscurity after the 2000s. Characters like Spiral and Omega Red are given center stage. And there's a full-on Mojo World stage with multiple levels. I'm genuinely curious how the characters were selected, because if you asked me which characters were popular at the time, I'd say this game was missing Gambit, Jubilee, Rogue, or at the very least Beast and Nightcrawler. But what do I know? I wasn't even alive when this game came out. Speaking of multiple levels, one of the first major innovations made over Street Fighter and Darkstalkers was the ability to knock each other through floors in a shower of debris, revealing a new stage below. The stage transitions also work horizontally, with some stages transitioning via ice flows or rivers during the fighting. It's always impressive and adds a big sense of adventure and impact to the fighting itself. Along with the larger levels and backgrounds, there's an increased sense of speed and verticality over Street Fighter, with characters being able to super jump and bounce off the walls, quite literally. It gives the game a more fast-paced, anarchic, and fun feel compared to many of the other Capcom contemporaries and fighting games at the time. Despite not sharing any staff with Darkstalkers, I checked, X-Men Children of the Atom bears many of the same artistic hallmarks, utilizing creative backgrounds and gorgeous, vivid colors to flesh out the world of the X-Men. It's also worth noting how much larger the staff role is for X-Men compared to the first Darkstalkers, which released the same year in 1994. Look, it's not the most balanced game in the world. Sentinel is as top tier as ever, and CPU difficulty in particular is a pain in the ass after the first few fights. But as a piece of art and a 90s fighter, Children of the Atom is a damn fun time that anybody should seek out and play, whether you're a fan of X-Men or just good fighting games. Releasing just 1 year after Children of the Atom, Marvel Superheroes maintains much of the game's stylistic hallmarks, including a host of new, gorgeously detailed stages, amazing background music, and an emphasis on air combat and high-flying acrobatics. However, Marvel Superheroes is the first to introduce some mechanics that would be included in Marvel games moving forward. Assists, in the form of Infinity Stones, which grant bonuses during battle, and the other thing they kept doing moving forward was reusing sprites. You see, the roster for this game is weird at first blush. Sure, you've got your Avengers and Spidey rep with the Webhead, Cap, Hulk, and Iron Man, but then the villains are Blackheart and Shumagorath. Yeah, not exactly heavy hitters. And then Juggernaut and Magneto, which are just reused assets from the previous game. There are secret unlockables like Doctor Doom and Thanos, who's an unlockable boss fighter, but out of the box you're looking at a game with 10 characters and 40% of them are reused from the previous game. But don't worry, nearly every character on here will get its time to shine eventually. See, that's the flip side of making these games so quickly. Capcom was ruling the fighting game roost, but they had to keep making these games, so as the series continues, you'll see more and more characters that have been reused, and less and less new characters. But we'll get there when we get there. The backgrounds, while not as colorful and wild as Children of the Atom, are still bursting with color and personality, and the various moving platform backgrounds are incredibly fun to watch and pick apart for franchise Easter eggs and whatnot. For the time being, this is still a traditional Capcom 1v1 fighting game. Ripped right from the pages of Marvel's Infinity Gauntlet, the player can collect various stones and use them in battle to give themselves boosts to health, damage, durability, and so on. The single-player game, it's a good way to get a leg up on enemies in an arcade quarter muncher. But if you put two pros in this game, it turns into an unbalanced nightmare. But in a good way. Like that nightmare I have sometimes where I spill Bruce Campbell's spaghetti and he slaps me. I spilled the spaghetti, but I got slapped by Bruce Campbell, so who can tell if it's really good or not? See, if you don't like fighting games, unbalanced gameplay can sound like a nightmare. And it can be, especially if you're a newbie going up against somebody who knows the score. But the anarchic chaos that ensues with unbalanced gameplay is why some of the most famous fighting games have stuck around for so long, including more of the games we'll see later in the series. Suffice it to say, balance issues aside, Marvel Superheroes is still a pretty good time. The core Infinity Stone gimmick is a matter of personal taste that I don't mind, some people hate it. But looking at the fighting game landscape at the time, I think it's a neat way to have fun with the license and help the game stand out mechanically from the pack without being just another Street Fighter II iteration. While the previous games were important for their roles in the Marvel vs. games, here's where the MVC legacy truly begins. Not only is this the first crossover with Capcom and Marvel characters, although Akuma was an unlockable secret previously, it's also the first game in the series to utilize tag team gameplay. The Infinity Stone gimmick is completely gone, replaced with a fast assist gameplay system that allows the player to call their tag mate onto the battlefield at any time. And there are still some new characters to be had here. Going back to an X-Men only roster lineup from Marvel, we see the same reused sprites, but with some new additions including the Raging Cajun and Sabretooth, which, seriously, how is this the first game Sabretooth is in? Like, we had a game with Spiral, but not Sabretooth. Also, the best girl herself, Rogue, in her first playable Capcom fighter. Just look at her go, she's perfect. Then on the crossover side of things, you've got your basic roster of Street Fighter, notably missing Vega, Balrog, and E Honda, but otherwise keeping the classic roster intact and pulling sprites from the more modern games at the time, like Street Fighter Alpha. Oh, and all of the Street Fighter sprites are just reused from other games. While the art styles between SF and the X-Men is still pretty well aligned, it wouldn't be long until Capcom's love of reused assets would create some big cracks in the series facade. The crossover here really works, and it immediately snaps into place why someone would see the cheesy heroes of Street Fighter and the colorful Marvel mutants and go, hey, why don't we watch this homeless man fight this giant boulder man to death? Seeing characters with similar aspects, or who might be evenly matched, face off as a treat, and as a longtime fan of both franchises, there's still a giddy, childlike appreciation in seeing Juggernaut fight Zangief, or Chun-Li teaming up with Rogue to battle Magneto. I'll be the first to admit, when it comes to these fast-paced tag fighters, I am out of my depth. I might be able to make it a couple rounds, but my brain just does not work with the level of memorization required to really pull off the impressive air combos and infinites I know these games have. And this game is fast. Unlike other Capcom fighters, there's no alternate control mode for easier inputs and no choice between regular or turbo speed. This game has 1 speed and it is furious. Like Rob Liefeld drawing feet on a deadline furious. Maybe a little bit too fast. The action hits as hard as ever, and the characters have a really nice weight to them while still being able to Cirque du Soleil their way around the battlefield. But I think some of the stages are too small to accompany the acrobatics. Speaking of stages, while the game has the same telltale gorgeous and expressive Capcom sprite art from the time, I think the stages are a bit more lackluster, falling short of the coolness of Marvel superheroes and certainly some of the crazier stages from Children of the Atom. There's no great Savage Land or Mojo World stages with multiple tiers or moving platforms. There are some stages with flashy transitions here and there, but overall I think the stage selection is lacking in the creativity that went into the early games. There's, however, a highlight in the form of a fuel processing plant that can be quite fun to blow up mid-battle. I think it's because this game is trying to split the difference between X-Men and Street Fighter, but the result is just fighting in malls. Wait a second. I know that pink bunny. What, in this mall? Wait a minute, we have to get out of here right now. So here's the thing. This game is just there. It exists. Between all these games, I often forget it exists.
I feel bad for you.
I don't think about you at all.
Because it doesn't have any gimmicks like the Infinity Stones, and it basically does the same thing as last time. Oh, they added assists, which is a big development, kinda, I guess, but this game doesn't have rogues, so what are we even doing here? Some of the Street Fighter characters have been switched up, and most of the X-Men have been replaced with characters who were in Marvel superheroes. There aren't any new characters here. Everything is reused. Something even X-Men vs. Street Fighter had with Rogue, Gambit, and Sabretooth. They bring back the weird B-side characters from Marvel superheroes, like Blackheart and Shuma-Gorath, but not Iron Man. They have Omega Red as the X-Men villain rep instead of Sabretooth or Magneto. The choices made here, even considering reused assets, are bizarre and make for a strange mishmash of a game. Don't get me wrong, it's still good fun and might technically be a better game. Seeing characters like Hulk and Cap fight alongside Ryu, Chun, Bison, and the rest feels almost as natural as X-Men vs. Street Fighter, and the gameplay is still satisfying and fast-paced. It's also worth noting that in terms of character variety, there are now 5 Shotos on the Street Fighter side, or characters who use a similar moveset of uppercuts, fireballs, and spins. Ryu, Ken, Sakura, Dan, and Akuma. So even in the game's already limited variety, there's even less in the characters themselves this time around. Unless you want to play as Dan, I guess. Side note, Sakura is canonically a child. She shouldn't be fighting murderous demigods. Ryu's a terrible mentor and role model. The game just feels like an asset flip, for lack of a better term. They even reused the Apocalypse boss fight as the game's semi-final boss, along with several of the game's previous stages. There are some new background additions like Nash, Gambit, and Rogue chilling in the background of one, but aside from some exceptions, it's a similarly dull background collection. With additional turbo and easy modes, the game feels like a classic fighting game revision rather than a sequel or iteration. Gameplay and even stages are largely the same, however, the swapped characters makes for a weird trade-off. Which game is better between superheroes or X-Men vs. Street Fighter? It comes down to a preference of characters and gameplay balance. Back in the day, fighting games had new updates and iterations all the time. That's why there are 4 different versions of Street Fighter 2. What's bewildering is the choice to cut characters instead of leaving the X-Men roster intact and bringing over all the characters from Marvel superheroes. But whatever, this game feels like a rushed update done to push through to what comes next. Even the menu for the opening moves, the super move animatics, and all the title fonts are cribbed directly from the next game in the series, the one that really started it all. Oh yeah, here it is. My first fighting game. This game was a lot of firsts for me as a kid. My mom bought it dirt cheap pre-owned from a Hollywood video. She didn't even know what Capcom was, she just knew that it had Spider-Man on the cover. Like I said, this was my first time for a lot of things. First fighting game, first tag fighter, first time hearing about characters like Mega Man and Ryu, let alone people like Captain Commando and this guy. God, I still don't remember his name. Want to say Gus? Doug? Geronimo? So close. was also the first time I saw Morrigan Ainsland, which would start a lifelong obsession with Darkstalkers and her very specifically. This piece of key art changed my brain chemistry forever. It's highly possible this one character in this one game made me the way I am today. Thanks, Mom. So what's the difference between this and the last two games, which were largely the same? Well, everything. Kinda. On the surface, Marvel vs. Capcom is a very similar game to X-Men and Marvel Superheroes vs., but instead of reusing the same backgrounds and swapping some characters, the entire roster got a rework and every background is brand new. And it goes even further in depicting a crossover between the two realms of Marvel and Capcom. The problem for me is that I grew up with the PlayStation version, which for some reason was gimped with only one playable character at a time. You had assists, but no character switching, so it's a bizarre hybrid fighter. I'm not sure what led to these concessions, as it was a running theme with previous games like Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, despite the game getting a nearly arcade-perfect port on the Saturn, a console that was less powerful than the PlayStation. Either way, playing the original arcade version is a new experience to me. First off, let's talk the roster. This game reuses a ton of sprites, pulling characters like Morgan and others from their respective games, but also introduces some new characters like Venom and War Machine. The roster as a whole isn't too much bigger than the last game, but is better balanced and offers a wider variety of gameplay styles to experiment with. There's also the special assist characters, who are essentially assist only, but include several returning heroes like Rogue, Iceman, Sentinel, and then a bunch of B-tier Capcom goobers. There's also entirely original characters like Jubilee somehow making her first appearance here, and Thor. Wait, Thor is just now in these games? Shumagorath has been in like 3 of these things. To me, this will always be my favorite Marvel vs. Capcom game. It has some of my favorite comic characters from when I was a kid like Gambit, War Machine, and Venom, and managed to hit just the right mix of hyperactive, over-the-top action to capture my attention and keep it for hours on end. And it's still a classic worth revisiting today. But for most hardcore fighting fans, they'd probably say the best is yet to come. I am bad at this game. Always have been. My brain just does not work with this. Something about the non-streamlined controls, the speed, and 3 character tags makes it a hassle for me to go back to, and I don't have enough of a local scene around here to make an effort to learn. Part of that is the overwhelming size of Marvel vs. Capcom 2. MVC 2 is big. Like Smash Ultimate, everybody's here, put it on the side of a building big. The roster brings back nearly every previous Marvel and Capcom fighter from the previous games, dating back all the way to Children of the Atom. Even goobers like Shumagorath, Silver Samurai, and Spiral, who returned for the first time since. Of course, Capcom is likewise pulling from Street Fighter, Darkstalkers, and others to reuse previous sprites as well. There are also a host of new characters to the series, including Cable, Marrow, speaking of obscure, and then original Capcom characters created for this game's story, like Amingo, Sansan, and Ruby Heart. Each of these characters not only has an entirely unique moveset and special move, but also multiple assist types that can be selected before a match. Multiply these 56 characters times 3 assist types and the variations of teams possible, and you have a nearly limitless amount of player potential in gameplay. Despite its overwhelming roster and gameplay variety, it's actually a simpler game to play, with only 4 buttons used opposed to the regular 6-button configuration. Another huge gameplay overhaul is the form of 3v3 tag system, allowing for more tactical options through team composition. It's no wonder why this game has garnered such a huge following. There's always something new to appreciate. It's unbalanced as hell, but that can lead to some of the most interesting matchups and unexpected strategies. The game runs on an entirely new engine, and launching at the dawn of the PS2 and Xbox era utilized its hardware for a hybrid 2D, 3D art style that it's still a choice. The thing about Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is that it is pure unbridled chaos. This extends even to the artistic choices. As anarchic and bizarre as some of the backgrounds can be, it's still nothing compared to the sheer gall Capcom had to reuse assets from over half a decade prior. The sprites of Darkstalker characters like Morrigan, which don't feature the more advanced shading of sprites even like the Street Fighter Alpha characters, was noticeably jarring in Marvel vs. Capcom 1. However, thrown into a blender with 3D assets in the background and 6 comparable characters in every match, the mismatched and aged character art is much more noticeable. The lighting and shading on the characters themselves betray that these aren't so much pieces of a cohesive artistic vision as they are haphazardly plucked from other products into an epileptic blender. But you know what? That's okay. This game thrives in the chaos. Like Smash Bros. Melee, it stood the test of time because it's so insanely over the top, but at its core is a rock-solid fighting game that players can spend hundreds of hours and never grow bored with. It's never been for me, to be honest, but not every game needs to be. However, as a stone-cold classic, it remains yet another unfortunate casualty of physical game rarity. I'm lucky enough to have bought it for $250 on Xbox Live Arcade back in the day, but unless you picked it up before it was delisted, let alone still have a 360 or PS3 out, you're out of luck without spending some crazy money. Now, you may have noticed that Capcom released nearly one Marvel fighting game every year from 1994 to 2000. But if you weren't there at the time, you might not know that so is everybody else. As the halcyon days of coin-op arcades faded into memory and the age of the home console drew nigh, fighting game devs had a hard time transitioning through the crowded market that they'd created. It wasn't just Capcom though. Capcom had contributed plenty with Street Fighter 2, 3, Street Fighter Alpha 1, 2, and 3, 3 Darkstalkers games, and more. But then you also had Tekken, Mortal Kombat, Dead or Alive, King of Fighters, Samurai Showdown, and an unfathomable amount of knockoffs and wannabes. As a result, there came a bit of a dark age for fighting games in the early 2000s. Hardcore fans still dug games like Smash and Tekken, and series like Mortal Kombat and Soul Calibur did well by giving players tons of unlockables, extra modes, and really good value. But for the most part, the fighting genre was a shadow of its former glory through the mid-aughts. Then Street Fighter 4 made a huge comeback, blowing down the doors for a more metered, though still passionate approach to fighting games. And Marvel vs. Capcom 3 was not far behind it. More than a decade after Marvel vs. Capcom 2, Marvel vs. Capcom 3 had some huge shoes to fill. So, did it? Well, not so much as it threw Marvel vs. Capcom's shoes away and then went to cobbling school, got a degree making shoes, so it made its own shoes and had better shoes. You know what? It's a clumsy metaphor. Point is, Marvel vs. Capcom 3, like Street Fighter 4, brought the series back while innovating and pushing it forward. In a big way, whips ass. In MVC3, gone entirely are the previous sprite-based art and backgrounds. Everything is 3D, yet the gameplay maintains the same frenetic pace and 3v3 structure. The gameplay has been further simplified to a 3-button configuration based on the Wii-exclusive Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, which is another all-time banger that is doomed to obscurity because somebody said, hey, let's put it on the Wii. Either way, the original game launched with 36 characters, each with their own assist styles from MVC2, and eventually an update, Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, would bring the roster to a respectable 50, just shy of Marvel vs. Capcom 2. But in fairness, there's more character variety in Marvel vs. Capcom 3. And what a roster it is. You've got crossover series mainstays like Wolverine, Spider-Man, Cap, Iron Man, Ryu, Chun, and Morrigan. Yeah, see, this game was like the first new Darkstalkers anything Capcom had made in a decade, and they put Morrigan, Felicia, and Cienko. Can't be mad at that. Of course, Capcom and Marvel had both come a long way since 2000, so you've got plenty of new blood in the fray, like Dante, Beautiful Joe, Sea Viper, and on the Marvel side, you've got loads of new rep like a classic Ghost Rider, deep cuts like X-Men 23 and Taskmaster, and even Rocket Raccoon. You can tell this was before Guardians of the Galaxy, the movie, came out because his design looks like shit. This game even had Deadpool, voiced by Nolan North, spouting one-liners and breaking the fourth wall with his special move. The last 2 characters released as DLC were Jill Valentine and Shumagorath. Sure, why not? This game manages to maintain the same anarchic spirit of Marvel vs. Capcom 2, but hone it into a love letter to every franchise involved. It's more accessible, has more variety, and like Street Fighter 4, the all-new comic book-inspired art style, which relies on heavy shading, still looks amazing today with its dazzlingly bright colors, active backgrounds, and various effects. It also came out before the MCU was in full swing. You get comic book accurate versions of these characters. Marvel vs. Capcom 3 is another game I'm not particularly good at, but I have played it a lot, and between nostalgia and how easy it is to play, it remains a damn good time to come back to. Now, who's ready for a sequel? I mean, man, they've got to really have a barn burner in the works for this next one, right? When I saw the trailer for Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, I screamed. Like, literally, I freaked out. The MCU was so big, I thought there was no way in hell Marvel would license these characters for another fighting game with Capcom. But they did. And sometimes I wish they didn't. Japanese game development being what it is, I doubt we will ever know what really happened with this game or what went on behind the scenes. But I don't think it was a fun experience for anybody involved. Like many Marvel game projects at the time, like Square Enix's Avengers and LEGO Marvel Super Heroes 2, there's a noticeable MCU-ness that permeates every inch of this thing. A marketing department urge to align the characters and depictions with the broadest appealing versions to hopefully gain more brand awareness, I guess. The problem is, this is directly at odds with everything that worked so well previously with the series. Let's get the changes out of the way first because there are a lot of them. We're back to 2 fighters per team with the Infinity Stones available as an assist a la Marvel Superheroes, although all of the assists are entirely different. The stones also allow for a unique Infinity Storm special move, all of which are also different. The roster, in keeping with the smaller teams, has been reduced to 30 at launch and 36 after DLC, and we're back to a 4-button configuration, though with concessions like auto combos that allow new players to jump right in and have fun. Sounds like a solid progression, right? Well, the first problem is the roster. Infinite was developed before Marvel owned Fox, so there's no X-Men rep, no Dr. Doom at all. If you've never played these games, you might say, who cares? But for now, generations of fighting game fans who loved Marvel, characters like Magneto, Doom, Sentinel, and Wolverine have become essential. Not to mention, Wolverine has been with the series since the beginning. It's kind of like if the next Mortal Kombat didn't have Scorpion or Sub-Zero. So what characters did make it? Well, you've got Spidey, Cap, Iron Man, of course, all sporting more MCU looks. Doctor Strange, Dormammu, and Ghost Rider also returned from Marvel vs. Capcom 3. And then you've got the real Marvel Cinematic Universe tie-ins like Captain Marvel, Ultron, Thanos, and Gamora. Winter Soldier, Black Widow, and Black Panther also take up 3 of the 6 DLC slots. Then on the Capcom side, you've got your mainstays. Ryu and Chun-Li representing for Street Fighter, Arthur, Firebrand, Nemesis, Chris Dante, and Spencer returning from Marvel vs. Capcom 3. Then you've got Jedha from Darkstalkers as a new character, and the Monster Hunter and Sigma as newbies, 2 of which are also DLC. You may have noticed there's a lot of returning characters, including some odd choices, like Spencer, the main character of Capcom's memorable Bionic Commando reboot from 2009, almost a decade later. That's because, in keeping with the series' legacy, most of the characters are reused assets. Which is because despite having the license of the most profitable movie franchise on Earth and a series with die-hard fans, this game was reportedly given less budget for its entire development than Street Fighter V's DLC. Yeah, the whole game, less money than Street Fighter V's bonus characters and costume packs. This is one of the more perplexing decisions that hold back Infinite, its obvious budgetary limitations. The others are when it attempts a more cinematic and realistic art style, and attempting a full cinematic story mode similar to NetherRealm's Mortal Kombat games. And then when all those decisions come together, the story in Infinite isn't so much a traditional narrative as it is a loose assemblage of fan fiction hastily thrown together when the devs weren't crunching themselves to death. The voice acting, even when done by characters' regular actors, is lifeless and ill-fitting. The script wouldn't pass a writing course taught by Peppa Pig, and it's just dull throughout. It doesn't help that, in throwing away the bright, colorful style of previous games, you're left with a low-budget AAA game chasing the Marvel Cinematic Universe with nowhere near the budget needed to accomplish the task. The cutscenes are filled with convenient off-screen moments to save animation budget, but what animation is on screen can feel unfinished at the best of times. The lighting on the models makes them look like grotesque, melting wax sculptures, and the rigging and models themselves, especially on the more muscular characters, can be downright horrifying. These characters weren't meant to be seen in realistic 3D. If they wanted 3D cutscenes, they needed style to cover up those flaws. But without said style, it just looks like a source filmmaker porn parody that never gets to the point. I mean, look at this. Just look at Dante.
Look how they massacred my boy.
And the real shame here is that Infinite is actually a fun game. Get past the bad story mode, a lackluster roster, and there's a lot to like. The same fast-paced actions here with plenty of depth and an entirely new gameplay approach compared to MVC 2 and 3. Gameplay-wise, it's not a bad evolution. Unfortunately, the ugly exterior and lack of classic characters, or even new characters for that matter, quickly hurt the game's public image, and it didn't meet Capcom's sales expectations, which was around 2 million units in the launch window, similar to Marvel vs. Capcom 3's sales in the same launch window. which I could understand if it was given a proper budget and development time, but considering the constraints, that judgment feels not just harsh, but overly cruel to the developers and fans who are looking forward to a bright future for Marvel vs. Capcom games. But then again, this game does have Thanos doing a Hadouken, so in spite of these flaws, it might be the best game ever made. And there you have it. Marvel vs. Capcom games have a long, sordid history. There are some classics, some overlooked gems, and some games that didn't get the attention they deserved. But at the end of the day, it's a consistently good series. The problem is, you can't reasonably play most of them on modern hardware. The licensing around these characters has kept players from experiencing these games and discovering them in a broader context. Even lovingly crafted collections like Iron Galaxies and Marvel vs. Capcom Origins was delisted and never re-released, meaning the only way to experience these games is through Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, Infinite, or emulation. It's a series that now sits uncomfortably in the industry's rear view, a warning to what happens when companies don't care for the IP that so many love and artists, creators, developers pour their souls into for years. It's a losing battle and nobody wins. Hopefully these wonderful games will make their way back to players in the near future. But until then, Excelsior.
Hello there, all my viewers, old and new. Thank you for sticking around to the end. I'm currently getting over a cold as I'm editing this together, hence why my voice sounds so bad. But I just wanted to hop in and say thank you very much, especially if you're one of the patrons listed here, for believing in me and continuing to support my content journey. I will be taking a short hiatus after this video, unless I am struck by inspiration like I was with the previous Everything is Woke and Righteous Anger videos, and I just feel like I have to get something out. I have several more videos planned and in the works, but I need to take a step back for a little while and focus on myself and focus on some other projects. I'll primarily be focusing on writing a screenplay and a manuscript, which I've been trying to finish. And if you would like to continue following my work, please go to the social media shown here and follow me on Patreon, where I will be showing off some of the edited portions of my book and manuscript when they are ready. Until then, thank you very much for watching and have a great day.